Welcome to Breaking the Couch, a weekly conversation demystifying what happens in and behind the therapy scene to support your healing journey. We're your hosts.
I'm Dr. Doughton, a licensed clinical professional counselor, a certified school psychologist, and a trauma specialist with Playfully Psyched.
And I'm Dr. Jo Harchi with Soft Heart Psychology, a licensed clinical psychologist.
We're here aiming to provide you with mental health tools to address the cycle of generational trauma across the age span, from infancy and childhood to adulthood.
For more information, visit our Instagram page at Breaking the Couch or our website, breakingthecouch.com. While we hope you love listening to and learning from our podcast, it's not a substitute for a relationship with a licensed mental health professional.
I'm really excited. We have someone joining us today, and we're going to do just a quick introduction and let him say hello. So we have, and again, listeners, please excuse me, I'm going to try my best to say his name with the appropriate accent, but I am a native English speaker, so we'll see how this goes. But today we're welcoming Dr. Jesús Barreto Abrams, who is finishing up his training to be a neuropsychologist, and he's a nationally certified American Sign Language interpreter. So we're so excited to have you here today, Dr. Barreto Abrams.
Thank you, Dr. Doughton, and your pronunciation was perfect. So thank you.
I kept practicing and practicing. Even though I know you very well, I just felt I'm going to be on camera and like, I'm going to jack this up. So I'm glad that I did it. Check it out. So, if I am remembering correctly, you had an amazing study for your dissertation that I thought would be really helpful to talk about on today's episode. And so we know that trauma can impact different fields. People of all parts of life, aspects of life, can be affected and impacted by trauma. And I think that your dissertation was on something related to, vicarious trauma, secondary trauma, developmental trauma, or some complex creation of what that is. So I thought maybe just to start off, would you tell us a little bit about what is vicarious trauma as a developmental trauma, or what does that mean or look like for people?
Sure, and I can talk about that topic for hours. Thank you for asking me. I did a study on vicarious trauma, and that's really what I focus throughout my doctoral studies. Vicarious trauma is an interesting concept because it's not about a trauma that you experience directly yourself, right? And a lot of people don't really think about that happening, right? It's a lot about being exposed to people that have trauma, whether it's in the workplace, it could even happen at home, right? In a personal sort of setting, but most of it's studied through sort of a workplace lens. And it's really important to consider what that means for people regularly, because I feel like some listeners might be attorneys, some might be in counseling or in psychology, and just feels like even being someone who is like a first responder might experience traumatic events or might hear about traumatic events. And I really studied sign language interpreters. And it is a developmental lens, what vicarious trauma is, right? Because it looks at how being exposed to traumatic events that other people experience, either whether it's hearing it, witnessing, could lead to a clinical sort of diagnosis. So that's sort of in between, but it's about being exposed over and over. And if you look at it through a developmental lens, right, it impacts the person yourself, and it impacts how you relate to other people as well.
So if I'm understanding correctly, developmental trauma, how I usually say it, right, is that it impacts the way you see the world and then the way you navigate within the world.
Exactly.
Is that right?
That is perfectly it. So it's how you navigate, and it's also how you see yourself. It's a lot about that image that you have on yourself. And for vicarious trauma, like, I'm not going to get theoretical because that's kind of boring, but it's really about it's about a lot of things that people don't think of, like safety, for example, or how you see yourself and your self-esteem, right? Things like that. But it's not only about how you think safety is, but how you think what other people interpret what safety is. You're just because of hearing something that could be not normal, right? In quotes, because we know that trauma is more common than what people make it seem.
Unfortunately,
Yeah, unfortunately. And like the thing is, it's like then people start sort of interpreting the world differently, inner world and outer world. And that's what vicarious trauma is in a nutshell.
Wow. So the way you see yourself in the world, and then your interpretation of how other people frame things like safety.
Exactly. And
Right.
another thing is trust, right? And I
That's what I was about to
know
say.
all of
Yeah.
us are psychologists, right?
Mhm.
Or have a psychology background. And one of the things that's really important is like trust. For example, we sort of, from a psychotherapy lens, we think about trust, but
Mhm.
it doesn't have to be a psychotherapy lens, right? Think about your friend who might have had a lot of traumatic event, and you're hearing their stories and you're like, whoa, like that's really
Mhm.
hard. And
Mhm.
then you start thinking of how maybe they trust you really well, but it's because of the bond that you've created, but they might not trust your other friend who is in the same group as much, right? And that's sort of what it means because of those relationships that you build. And it's very complex, as we all know trauma is, and
Yeah.
people experience it very differently. And I think it's an interesting topic because it's not about someone directly experiencing it, it's about the exposure of people who have experienced it, and now you're sort of vicariously living the trauma through them.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you so much for sharing that. What's coming up for me right now is really thinking about, and I've talked about this, behind the scenes, but working as a trauma therapist, right? And having worked in schools and hospitals and clinics and telehealth, all these different spaces with trauma survivors of really young ages, I often say, like, I've seen the worst of humanity, right? Like, I've seen what can happen to really young children, things that are unimaginable. I've heard stories about what's unimaginable. And when I think about myself before doing this work, which is kind of hard because I've been doing this work for so long, so it's a little hard for me to see myself. But when I think about her, who she was before this, I don't think she navigated the world with quite as much caution. And when I think about the children in my life that I love and protect, and I work, so I have some nieces that I work really hard to not be overbearing. Because they're not my children, right? Like, I don't have a say in how they're raised and developed. And I want their parents to have some of that carefree, let them have their childhood. And yet at the same time, I'm like, but this can happen and that can happen. And
Mhm.
but like I know it might not be statistically relevant, but like for me it is, because that's all I see, right? That's my world. So it sounds like you're saying that I'm experiencing the effects of this vicarious trauma, this repetitive exposure to traumatic situations that, some of these things have never happened to me, but seeing what's happening in the world has impacted the way I show up for family and friends. Come over here diagnosing people already, Dr. Barreto Abrams.
I am not, it's kind of heavy to really think about it if you really
Mhm,
start thinking about it.
mhm.
But, that's why I mentioned psychotherapists and attorneys, right? Because both are like the research shows that it's pretty common amongst those fields, right? And that's why I was interested in sign language interpreters. But it is that if you really think about it, right, developmentally, everyone changes, right? But when you're exposed to these things, like you said, like one of the common things is that you hear people, if you're really focusing on vicarious trauma, it's like, oh, I heard someone who lives down the street who said that something happened at the bus stop. I'm not going to that bus stop. I'd rather walk half a block now, right? That's kind of that
Mhm.
concept of how your world sort of starts shifting because of that, because that didn't happen to you. It's you heard someone that
Yeah,
told someone, and it's that effect of how you start changing.
yeah.
And that's why it's developmental.
Wow, wow. Okay, this got heavy real fast.
I know.
So, okay, maybe I don't know if this is a little bit lighter, but flip it a little bit. So you work as an interpreter as well, right? As a sign language interpreter, right? So I'm wondering if you'd be willing to share if you've ever had an experience, whether it's uncomfortable or traumatic interpreting event or a series of events. If you could tell what that was like for you, maybe explain that situation if something comes to mind.
Uncomfortable and traumatic are very different. So I
They
can
oh,
start with uncomfortable.
okay.
Um, I had many of uncomfortable experiences as an interpreter. Let's start there.
Okay.
I've worked in a lot of different settings as an interpreter, and it's really interesting because when I first got into the field, I didn't want to become a sign language interpreter. It was something that people like, I wanted to learn sign language and be in the deaf world and meet people and use the language. And then sort of professors was like, you should try to become an interpreter. And I'm like, that's not something I'm gonna do. Then a couple of years later, I was sitting down for a test, and a couple of years later, I was sitting for the national certification. So it's really odd how I ended up becoming an interpreter. And looking back, that's what I feel like one of my identities is as an interpreter, right? I don't interpret as often anymore, but I was interpreting a lot when I lived in DC, and I did. And because of that experience, right, I interpreted for the government. I interpreted in this concept. It's called video relay services, where someone makes a phone call, because everyone has access to phone calls as hearing people, right? And you get to call, and deaf people get to use an interpreter if they're calling the bank or something like that. Well, one uncomfortable experience is going to be a little bit silly and maybe not so appropriate, so I want to frame it that way. But I used to do, because I was doing my doctoral program, I used to do the night shift often, and you know what happens during night shifts often, right? So you get to interpret a lot of uncomfortable situations, like people calling their partners or boyfriends or girlfriends or whomever, and you're in the middle of listening to uncomfortable stuff and situation, and that's very uncomfortable. It's not traumatic, and that's why I framed it that way, right? And you're like, what do I do? And then I don't have a poker face, but I need to know that I'm in an interpreter in an interpreter role. So I'm like signing, and I'm like, what is this? What is this lady telling me to tell her boyfriend, or what is this partner telling me to tell the other partner? I'm like, I've never heard these things, but I think this is what it means.
But it does make you, it's not, yes, trauma and uncomfortable are not the same. But it does make me think about, I don't know if this has happened to you, but how it can change the way you think about the world and the things that you do. Because I did see a movie, I don't remember the title of it, but they had a similar situation where there was an interpreter, and they did a horrible job, but it was an interpreter who was interpreting for a caller who was calling like a sex line.
Yes.
But it was bad because the interpreter didn't want to interpret you're calling a sex line. So like, so she was like filtering stuff. And I'm like, that's not, it was really bad. Yeah, it was really unprofessional, not good. But it also just made her like, it was basically how she felt like those types of calls were wrong. Therefore, she didn't want to engage in it. So not trauma specifically, but just that idea, like when we have these jobs where we show up as humans, where we're not just like machines and we are impacted, we're also making these decisions based on our own belief systems, right? That can impact the patient, client that we're working with at that time. And so not trauma, but impactful still.
Impactful for sure. I feel like, I had to go in, and I have to be like, Jesus is staying out the front door, and I'm sitting here, and if this person and that person are telling the nasties to each other and doing all of that, I'm going to be in that. And then I might be like, oh, what did I do? But it doesn't matter. My job is to be there, to be present, and to be like, sure, oh, you're going to do all of those things? Oh, okay, sure. Like, here, you get them. You get access. Because at the end of the day, it's about access, right? That is the work that you do. So that interpreter that's doing that, they're not providing access. So maybe they're in the wrong field. They might have to interpret at a school or something where that could still happen.
Maybe a church, clergy. I don't know. Because that's definitely happening in schools to some extent.
For sure. Yes. But yeah, like I feel like that's interesting. But you hear a lot and you see a lot, right? So that's the uncomfortable piece. And sometimes like just holding yourself together and like not laughing, because you're like, sometimes I interpreted they were like 60 or 70. And I've never heard 60 or 70-year-old people talking dirty to themselves, right? And I'm like, oh my gosh, like inside. And I'm like, don't laugh, be professional, one. And two, this is so awkward. Like, what am I doing? And it's like, And you want to like remove yourself, and I feel like it's the same thing for trauma, right? Sometimes you just want to remove yourself from the situation when someone is sharing something to you that's very strong, and it's sort of the similar point, and you're like, what do? I go on autopilot and I just do it, right? If I'm interpreting, or if you're listening, I'm just gonna autopilot listen. But at the end of the day, I had to be there, because if I go on autopilot, like, then I'm not really doing my job as an interpreter. But I also experienced interpreted a lot of traumatic things that were really, really rough. From I started with the uncomfortable because it was lighter, and
let's lighten it up, and then we
can. But a lot of traumatic things, if you're interested in me like sharing to the most that I could interpret, right? In the same kind of line of work, like video relay services, a lot of traumatic things happen. And the thing is, you get to see the deaf person, right? So I got to see people bleeding because of domestic violence, for example, and me being the person that's calling like sort of either a shelter or calling a crisis line or calling the cops, right? So that is also very heavy, and a lot of people don't think about interpreters doing that. But if we think about interpreters who are in other countries, right, who might speak a very specific language, right, who other people might not know, they might be in the middle of war events, right, interpreting things too. I interpreted for the government, and obviously I'm not going to disclose the things that I talked about, that I was exposed to, but there were a lot of things that I interpreted for that most people don't know of. I saw pictures that I would never want to see, of things that happen, right? I wasn't a war interpreter, obviously, because deaf people don't go to the army and stuff, but there are deaf people making decisions for governmental agencies. And some of the things that I was exposed to, I was like, wow, like, this is a lot for me as an interpreter, because when you're in school, you're thinking about interpreting in a college and K through 12, right? And a lot of times when you're so excited to go into the field, it's exciting, but it feels like it's perfect and good, and you're going to be interpreting concerts and shows, and then you sort of become a professional interpreter, and you're like, I never know what I'm going to get. Like, I'm going to walk in and it could be anything.
Oh, that sounds so relatable, right? Like, you can get anything. It's just, it made me, I thought thoughts came up of like working in hospital. So I've done that, and it's different than private practice, where you kind of select your caseload versus in a hospital. And I worked in like ICU and the NICU, and so just everything comes at you, right? You get what you get, and you have to learn to deal with that. So I wonder, what advice would you give like other interpreters for self-care, who may be tuning into this when thinking about interpreting for traumatic events or scenes or situations, especially repetitively?
Obviously, I'm going to talk through my research, because that's, I feel like, a lot of things. A lot of interpreters, I interviewed for my master sort of project, my pre-dissertation, I should say. I interviewed a lot of interpreters, and a lot of them are doing really good things, particularly those who are interpreting frequently traumatic events. And some of them have come up with great strategies. Like, one person always uses the same outerwear. So they have a jacket that they really love. That's a protective piece of garment that they always bring if they know that it's going to be something traumatic. Like, if they're going to court and it's something that is related to, for example, sexual assault, or a minor involved, they're going to bring that piece, right? Or if they're going to interpret something that's really, really strong, and it's about something that there's going to be violence or something, so they bring that. So one of the things that happens is people start getting less involved with their family for some reason after they're doing that, which, if you really think about it from a psychotherapy lens, people might start shutting down a little bit, right?
Absolutely.
And that's what happens. So other people have found that, sure, they need to do that for a period of time, but not forgetting to be part of their friends or family, or trying to connect again. It's something that's really important, that I would encourage people to self-care. Like, yes, recharge, but also remember that it's not only recharging alone, because that could bring a whole slew of things. A lot of people who are interpreters are really stuck with the idea that they have to impersonate the person, right, and be part of it. And some of my research showed that, like, people automatically might disengage, right, especially if they're more experienced than less experienced people.
Mm-hmm.
And by disengaging, I mean, right, in interpreting, we use a lot of eye language. So if the deaf person, or even if it's spoken language interpreting, not sign language, right?
Mm-hmm.
They're saying, I went to the store, then you interpret, I went to the store, just like that in the other language.
Mm-hmm.
But there's an interpreting technique that people often think it's not appropriate, but I found out in my research that people use that it's like, the person is saying blah, 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 and they explain it because that way I'm not explaining what my child went through. And that's an example that I got during my research, like explaining how someone went into details about what happened to their child. And they're like, oh, I do this, right? Because I asked them to journal after a period, like for a couple of weeks, I asked them to journal, and then they had to send me their journals. That's a couple of things that I feel like are important, but I also think that therapy is really important, right? If they can afford it and they can get services, that's one other piece, because it's about that. It's not only about what you can do by yourself. It's a lot about deconstructing what you're building at work that you're not even noticing that's happening. And this is the same for any field, really. All of these strategies, obviously not the interpreting strategy, though he said, blah, 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 that doesn't count. But it's the same for other fields, right? Like trying to do the same things. And one of the things I always come back to that trust piece, because that's why the trust and safety, like really looking at, yes, that one event happened, right? For example, we were talking about the bus stop. That event did happen, but how many times have you been at the bus stop and that event happened? Like trying to think about the possibilities, because it could have been a coincidence that day, right? That something happened at that bus stop. And then now you have to walk a block, and maybe you can't walk a lot because you have medical conditions or something like that, but you still have to take public transportation, right? So those are the things that are just coming up right now.
Right. This can apply to any field, and just also just trauma survivors who are not just being exposed to traumatic situations at work. One thing we've never talked about with the partners of first responders. And so they might not hear all the details of things, but they might hear enough to where they're also being impacted by that. And so one of the main things I heard you talking about was like creating community, or using your community, your support network, making sure you have that to not experience this in isolation, or to not be completely isolated. And I loved the interpreter who kind of uses a specific garment. So we do that in therapy, or what's one of the things that I recommend to like supervisees is, kind of shaking it off, or moving that layer, letting the hard thing, the traumatic thing live with the item and not with the person, with yourself. Even I had a supervisor who would even just like stroke her arms and shake it off at the end of session, and like metaphorically go over to the trash can and like throw that off when it was a really, really hard session of helping someone process a traumatic event. Because we do personalize, we show up in our sessions. And you mentioned when people are listening to a loved one share a traumatic story or recount, we have a tendency to maybe try to disengage when it's too much. We also have a tendency to jump to try to say the thing that's going to make them feel better, because we're so uncomfortable in our space. And so I think that some of these tips can be really helpful for even, the average person listening that wants to help someone else, right? Like, you can hold it for someone without owning it. And these are the ways that you can do that, right? By kind of removing yourself just a little bit from the situation, because it didn't happen to you, even though your brain is trying to tell you that it could and that it might, and all those things. So I think that was really helpful information for a wide range of audiences.
I'm over here taking notes. I'm like, okay, this is really good stuff, right? The energy separation. I loved that. And just kind of a protection piece too. I really like that. All the parts in therapy, right? Because if there is something that pushes a wound, besides it creating a new wound, it could push on our old stuff too.
Oh, yeah.
So I love therapy for that part too, but I took notes on all of it. I was like, oh, this is so good. I'm just curious, if you mentioned that this is a part of your identity now, and I appreciate you sharing that. And then you also mentioned, your lived experience as an interpreter and as a psychologist. And I'm just curious, do you ever see folks who are interpreters for this kind of exposure to trauma, this trauma stuff?
because I'm focusing a lot on neuropsychology. So I haven't done therapy really in the past 2 years because I focus on sort of my specialty. But it is something that I do look forward coming back, right? Because one of the things is there's not a lot of support, right? There's not a lot of understanding how to manage these kind of things. And there's two sort of challenges with that, right? One is that interpreters might be like, I don't want to see an interpreter, right? Like they're like,
Right.
oh no, someone from like this small pool of people already, right? And the other
Mhm.
thing is, it's like I think of it, I'm like, but as an interpreter who has actually practiced in the field, right? As an interpreter who also has a background in psychology and who works, I feel like even though I'm specializing in neuropsychology, I do not only want to do assessments because that's also not sort of, I want to do a little bit of everything, and that's what I've always wanted to do. And you know what? I feel like I do want to sort of bring back people, and that's something that I've really toyed around with, like eventually as soon as I'm able to practice independently and don't not be in the confines of sort of some institutions and some rules and stuff like that.
Sure.
That is something that I really, really would like to do. Yes.
Yeah.
That's so cool to hear.
Makes me think about, because we talk a lot about therapy, but trauma impacts diagnosing, and diagnosing isn't just a therapeutic intervention, right? Or just a therapeutic practice. You diagnose in assessment as well. And so I am wondering if you have any stories or comments or thoughts about the representation of trauma in diagnosing through an assessment lens, and or how might working with an interpreter impact diagnosing via assessment or therapy.
I'll start with assessments from a cognitive standpoint, neurocognitive testing, right?
Mm-hmm.
And trauma lives in the brain. Let's
Yep.
start there.
Mm-hmm.
People don't really think of it, and it's kind of sad to even not think about trauma being something that impacts the brain. If we go back to children, right? Children who are exposed to trauma, and when I'm talking about trauma, I'm not talking about only like the worst of the worst. I'm talking about any traumatic event.
Emotional neglect, even.
Right, emotional neglect, not even feeding, for example, them, like that kind of neglect too, that's more severe. Just anything in general, like children then won't be able to be present at school if you really think about it, right? Which then impacts how they're learning, which then impacts their development as a whole, with one of those being cognitive development, right? So then we see children who might have, quote unquote, a disability, right? But it's really a disability stemming from trauma, which then people are like, oh no, they have a learning disorder, right? And you start digging and you're like, well, they're in a school, for example, if they're in a place that there's a lot of trauma happening in the environment, they're in a school that has poor resources, which then also impacts, right? That could also be perceived as a traumatic sort of variable to everything. And then the child is now growing impoverished from learning, but they're also experiencing impoverished, like emotional development because it's being taken away or they're being added to that, and social development is going to be impacted. That's just one piece of the trauma that I'm talking about. And then I'll use sort of adults as well as an example. And then you see a child that is then being classified as something else because then the trauma is not something that's really happening, right? Or the kid that is experiencing so much trauma because maybe they have a parent who might be violent and they're waking up at 4 a.m, like because they're hearing violence or stuff like that, and then now they're in the classroom sleep deprived and they're dissociating. So then they're the kid that is failing classes and the teacher doesn't care about that student because they're not a problem in the classroom, right? They're the kid who is just failing because they don't want to learn, and they're focusing on kids who might have more problematic behavior.
They don't want to learn low effort. I'm a school psychologist by training, right? So you already know you're about to get me on a soapbox that we don't have time for. But yes, tell the audience.
Well, I'm trying to sprinkle a little bit of everything because I know that this is something that you all have know, and you as a school psychologist by training, right, know very well. But the opposite is true too. Then that we have the child who doesn't respond that way to trauma, but then they respond with behavioral problems, and then they don't have trauma. They have like ODD or like diagnostically something that it's like DMDD, right? Like a mood dysregulation that it's so severe that it's almost bipolar disorder. And it's like, did you really think about where that's stemming from, right? Like,
No,
let's
they
really
don't.
look at the environment. And a lot of psychologists, a lot of therapists, a lot of psychiatrists, they don't consider it, right? They're considering the thing that's right in their face, and it's like it's more complicated than that.
And even when they do, I've been told, like I worked at one school and we actually couldn't use it as a diagnosis because they said, well, you can't prove that in the same way that we can outline the diagnostic criteria for oppositional defiant disorder, ODD, right? Or like we don't have a good mechanism right now to trace back what happened to them when they were 2-year-old in the environment and the living conditions that they had at 2 and now they're 8. And I'm like, yes, we do. And they're like, no, we don't. And so like there's this back and forth and they're like, we need to be able to put this specific thing is related to happening in this classroom, the here and now, whatever. So that's also that's a flaw in the field, right? So being someone who can assess and diagnose and test cognitively and still being told my conclusion is inaccurate. It's like, well,
I as like I've never been a school psychologist or trained as a school psychologist, and I know that the confines like of what you can write and how you can explain things are also a little bit different because of how school systems are sort of established, which also makes me really upset oftentimes, right? And not upset at the school psychologist. I get a lot of reports from school psychologists when I'm evaluating children. I work with all ages, and I know that it's not the school psychologist, right? And then when I'm seeing it, I actually am not afraid to write it out and be like, obviously at this point, like I have someone who might approve or not out of it, right? A supervisor. But oftentimes if I like make a good argument, right? And I'm like, this is why we need to explain this. I have not found it to be an issue of them saying no, not included, because then you can bring that to the school again, because most parents are going to try to use it at the school. Or even not, like you can always recommend the parent. It's not going to work, right? But I want it to be documented somewhere where it states, look, this is what's happening, and there's all these things that are affecting. Because at least that's a framework that I use. And then we see adults too, and with adults it's similar, right? You sometimes see what you see in the profile, like a neurocognitive profile for someone that just experienced a traumatic event. You see these things that don't match up, right? You see someone who's underperforming or who has poor effort is the word they use, or lower effort. It looks like that, and sometimes it's written like that too, like poor effort or no effort based on these tests, right? And you really have to look at it, what's happening. I had a really interesting situation happen where the patient was, I use the word patient, I know there's other words like clients and
I use
other
patient.
words. Okay. Where my patient was dissociating in the testing. Obviously they're going to do bad, right? But the patient it was really powerful for them to hear that it didn't make sense that in a harder test they did a lot better, or like from a brain perspective that wouldn't make sense, right? And then it was really powerful for them to hear what you're really experiencing is not really a memory problem, it's that you're not present. And when you're not present, and the whole reason for them coming was for memory issues. They actually had something traumatic happen, and it involved like an injury to the head, right? And there was nothing that could support that it was actually a brain thing. And it was more of like they were not present, and you could see how they changed, right? Like at least for someone who has also trained in therapy and who has done, compared to many neuropsychologists who have only done neuropsychology, right? Someone who has done a lot of therapy and has worked a lot with the community. It was really interesting seeing it in a way that they could hear like, wow, this is something that could happen. And that makes sense, because I can feel like in one class I can pay attention during a college student, but in the other class I couldn't, right? Oh, interesting. So that kind of discrepancy was sort of powerful. And we told them, get therapy, make sure that you work with someone that specializes in trauma, right? Like don't go to someone that's just there to support you, but someone that knows really what they're doing. Someone like try to attend to a group that it's for trauma survivors, for that kind of trauma, right? And then come back in a year and let's see what things look like then. And then we can make a more definitive answer. And the thing is, even though, right, from a cognitive perspective, a lot of people are expecting accommodations in college, right? Trauma is an accommodation in college, right? They're dissociating, so they need extra time in their test, for example. That's something
Absolutely.
that we wrote for their college journey of, at least for, so we see them next year.
Mhm.
You need more time in testing. You need a place that it's like good for you, like in a testing center or something like that. And actually focus on them and their needs and what they want from that perspective too. So it's not about, I think assessments are not only about, hey, you have trauma and that's it, right? It's about really the needs and meeting there. And what I sometimes hear from peers or from supervisors or from everything, I'm like, it's about the whole person, regardless what we're doing in this field. Even in interpreting, it's about the whole person and providing access and providing the support that they need.
I love that you brought that up. It's the recommendations. I didn't understand that because that's not how most of my supervisors thought about it until I worked in a clinic that was for really, really young children, and I saw the power of recommendations, right? And that's what assessment has the power to do. But I also think what I want to go back to just a little bit is what happens in schools, because again, having school psych background, but then also the clinical psych background, what happens in schools is you have these, diagnostic criteria that you have to meet, there's certain codes that you have to align with, and trauma doesn't necessarily fall into one of those. You have to really argue for trauma to fall into like other health impairments, right? But by us continuing to advocate through the assessment practice, it can help change the culture of our society to understand what type of environment is conducive to learning, what can trauma do to the brain, and how can we change the environment in order to help children and adults, throughout the lifespan. And then, like you said, it's really beautiful in college because there is more flexibility in what type of accommodations we can get for the types of diagnoses or issues that a person is coming up with. So I think that's important. So it is important for us to keep lobbying, for us to keep talking about trauma, to keep trying to put it in the assessment reports, because it's all about like how we're able to help the whole person, as you said, and then the sustainability of our humans, right, of our species, to be able to provide environments that are safe and nurturing and full of learning opportunities. Because you can't remember what you never encoded, what you never put in your brain, what you never attended to or pay attention to can't be recalled because it didn't get in, right? And so I love that. Thank you so very much for sharing all of that. I don't know if you had something you wanted to wrap up with, Dr. Jaharchi.
Yeah, we are so grateful that you're here. And, I'll just kind of touch on a couple of the points that we talked about today. You shared with us what exposure to trauma does. Later on, you also told us about, some uncomfortable examples and some traumatic examples of kind of what it's like to be an interpreter. And you also shared with us some amazing tips. I'll kind of share those. One was like a outerwear or a protective piece that you can kind of leave at the door or like energetically separate from, if I understood that correctly, and I love and I know and I'll be using. And then there's also one about like engaging and connecting with loved ones or reconnecting. And then explaining to someone else, and I hope I get this right, but explaining to someone else what is happening or what the person is saying from their perspective without using eye language. So kind of like another separation piece, but actually like linguistically and cognitively, I think. I'm seeing you nod your head. Yeah. Okay, cool. And then the last one was therapy, right? We all, I think, love that one. And then, yeah, trauma-informed neuropsychological assessment, and kind of gave us some information about the impact of diagnoses and recommendations, which I too loved. Yeah.
So amazing summary. So Dr. Barreto Abrams, where can listeners connect with you, have follow-up questions, learn more about neuropsychology, interpreting trauma, all the things? Where can they find you?
Sure. Right now, my website's under construction, so just bear with me. But you can always email me at Jesus, JESUS, at Interneuronas, INTERNEURONAS.com. Interneuronas is a play between interpreting and neuronas, which neurons in Spanish, because I speak Spanish too, right?
Nice. Nice. Awesome. For listeners, you always can find us on Instagram, tag us in your stories at Breaking the Couch. You can check us out on YouTube, where you can find a fully captioned video version of this. Spotify is also now doing video versions. That version isn't going to be captioned. However, you can go over to our website and you can get a document that has like paragraph form of our transcript. So that's something for people who want that kind of access. We do have that available, and that's just breakingthecouch.com. So feel free to connect with us. Let us know if you have questions, ideas, topics you want us to put on the podcast, and we will connect with you soon.
If you are looking for a therapist for yourself or your child, you can visit our websites, playfullypsych.com or softheartpsychology.com.
We appreciate you joining us this week and can't wait till there's another opportunity to jump on the couch with you next week.